This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. The idea of walking into a flat Earth convention, it makes my tummy hurt. But for Dr. Lee McIntyre, it was an exercise in curiosity explored in the introduction of his new book, How to Talk to a Science Denier. Dr. McIntyre is an author, a research fellow at Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University, and an instructor in ethics at Harvard Extension School. An award-winning teacher, McIntyre has penned several popular titles on the philosophy of science and anti-science sentiments and strategies. His latest, published by MIT Press this year, is a dive into science denial in the modern era. How to Talk to a Science Denier combines Dr. McIntyre's own experiences and thoughts with a well-executed explanation of what, somewhat ironically, science and history can tell us about the current state of science denial. The book itself covers subjects ranging from climate denial to conspiracy theory, flat Earth to anti-vaxxers, and more. However, as I learned by reading the book and through my conversation with Dr. McIntyre, curiosity, compassion, and disconfirming inquiries will play a far greater role in bringing science to those who deny it than I initially thought. I'd like to start by asking a bit about the premise for writing this book. You are a philosopher of science, you have an impressive background, you have multiple books, and now you have penned How to Talk to a Science Denier. What was the conversation like between you and maybe any partners you have or the publisher about this book and why it was important to get out?
You know, it's funny. I didn't really have any conversations with anybody else about this being the next book. What happened is I have been a scholar in the philosophy of science for some years and had written a number of books about topics that were related to science denial. In fact, I had just finished one called The Scientific Attitude, which the premise of the book was that you really need to understand what science is in order to be able to defend it.
Yeah.
And then as I was out on the road giving talks in support of that book, people kept saying, well, we agree with you. What can we do? What should we say to science deniers? And I got to thinking, there's another book. And plus, I should be out there doing more of that. I shouldn't just be going to these blue bubbles and having conversations with folks who had read my book and already agreed with it. I should be out there talking to people who disagreed with me and then write about that. So that was really the process. And it's a different kind of a book for a philosopher to write. I'll grant you that.
I quite enjoyed reading it myself. And as part of my research, I tend to read things multiple times. And what I really found is there's two ways to read this book. The first is to just kind of skim through it. And you can look at, everything's nicely organized and you've broken out a concept. So there's a nice section on I believe it's the 5 core elements of science denial, conspiracy theory, and all of that, which you can kind of sit through and go one at a time, or you can read it the whole way through and really delve into the research, because you do include a lot of really well thought out explanations of existing research. And I found it was a nice sort of 2-track book of, if I want a quick idea, I can grab it, but you can also then sit and really dig in to how people think and how people reason and what goes on there. What goes into the process for you for collecting that much different and again, academia, that much study, and then being able to say, all right, I'm now going to put this into a book?
I never really thought about the process in that way. It's just the kind of book that I write where I want to make sure that I get the research right because I'm an academic.
Yeah.
But I also want to make sure that it's easy to read and engaging for the general public because I want to reach a larger audience. And so part of that, one thing that people comment on in the book is that there are 80 pages of footnotes. So, I do want to document, I do want to show that there's some research behind this and, some of the things that I don't necessarily want to put in the text, but I'll put in the footnotes. But I try to put a little humor in the footnotes too, just to reward the people who are going to go to maybe that third level and read the footnotes. So, I'm glad you brought it up the way that you did, because I don't write it to be skimmed. I write it to be read, but I do like my books to be organized so that somebody can, get the main idea if they look through it quickly. But I guess I can't help it. I'm a philosopher. There's an argumentative structure to the book, but it should also be a fun read. What I've learned over my years as a public philosopher is that sometimes people are more convinced by a story than they are by an argument. So if I can just give a good example or tell a good story, and especially in a book like this, where I can tell a story about going to a flat earth convention, people love that kind of stuff. But there's a serious purpose to it, but they love the story.
I was absolutely amazed by that introduction and thought, I'd say once a page, I thought, well, I would have left. Just every time, right? I couldn't imagine being in that room. Now, granted, I don't have the skills to have the arguments. My background is journalism, and a big part of that for me is recognizing that I have a very little bit of knowledge about an awful lot of different stuff. And the idea of confronting someone without knowing fully all of the information just terrifies me, because it feels like saying, well, I know and you don't. And then they say, okay, what do you know? And they're going, well, stuff.
I did feel a little bit of that because there were moments when they would quote something to me from physics that I knew was wrong, but I didn't know enough physics to be able to tell them precisely where it was wrong. But it didn't matter, because even amongst the things where I knew what they got wrong, if I told them, they wouldn't accept it anyway. Because the bottom line is, as you know from the book, I wasn't there to argue evidence and facts with them, because they already knew all that and had rejected it. I was there to talk about their argumentative strategy. And that I felt very well prepared to talk to them about as a philosopher. I can talk about reasoning and logic and conspiracy theories and cherry picking, all day. That was fine with me. And so really, it was an attempt to listen to what they had to say about, not only what they believed, but why they believed it. But then I pulled a little bit of a fast one, because I think they were expecting me to say, yes, but what about Galileo? Or, what about, the certain experiments from the history of science? And I didn't do that. What I did was say things like, well, it seems like your view is based on evidence. And they'd say, yes. Or of course. And I'd say, well, then tell me this. And they thought I was going to say, what's your evidence? But instead I said, what evidence could I pull out of my back pocket to show that you were wrong?
Yeah.
And they hated that question. They couldn't answer that question, because in order to answer that question, you'd have to have a scientific frame of mind. You'd have to be able to say, I'm willing to stake my belief on this thing being true. And if it's not true, then my belief is false. And they would not do that. So I had a little bit of, even though I was there and it was just me and 650 of them, I wanted to put it on my turf. I didn't just want to talk about the moon landing and, hull down ships over the horizon and, all of those other things.
Yeah. And it's funny. Quick anecdote. As I was reading this, I was thinking about that situation of being in a position of arguing with someone about anything. And in advocacy work, we're often trying to correct misinformation. Yes. And I was thinking about what it's like to be sitting there and trying to engage with someone who has said more or less that they are unwilling to engage, but somehow is using engagement to try it. It's almost like going to a bar and being the guy who just says, hold me back all the time. Never actually getting into a fight or anything. It's this weird, I'd almost say posturing. And I've got a bunch of notes that go all over the place, but I'm going to skip ahead to one where you at one point make a link to trauma. And you reference the language and experiences of the people you met at that convention. And you note there isn't a lot of evidence in the psychological literature currently on that connection.
That's right.
So I've got two parts to a question. One, could you explain a bit more about how those two ideas fit together in your mind? I think the connection is, I understand it to a degree because I've done a fair bit of reading on trauma, and I think it does feel natural, that sort of connection you're making. But as a sort of fun interesting aside, when you begin the process of this kind of speculation without the confirming evidence, do you have a mantra or an emergency brake in mind to prevent yourself from going down that slope of supposition into where the science deniers exist?
Yeah, I am constantly reminding myself in a situation like that I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a physicist either. And so, there are limits to what I'm able to draw evidence for and make inferences about. I regarded it as something of a sociological fact, a demographic fact, that a number of the people that I spoke to, who, by the way, were very willing to talk about their experiences and their beliefs and why they believed it, said that the reason that they got into flat Earth was because of some enormous breach of trust in their life. Sometimes it was a physical injury. Sometimes it was an emotional or psychic injury. People talked about divorce, serious illness, etc. A number of people mentioned 9/11 as an event that was so appalling and so overwhelming that they decided on its basis that this couldn't be real and the government must be lying to us. And if they're lying to us about that, what else are they lying to us about? And that's how they got into flat Earth. So I think of flat Earth as about distrust, just profoundly about not. It's that they don't trust the people who are giving the information. That's why the information doesn't convince them.
Yeah.
Because you can overcome doubt with evidence. You can't overcome distrust with evidence because you don't trust the person. Now, showing up in person to try to engage them, I was trying to build some trust. But this question of trauma kept coming back in a way that was kind of fascinating because I hadn't expected it. And I've since learned of the work of a psychologist down at Texas Tech named Ashley Landrum, who's done some studies on flat earthers and is now currently writing a book on flat earthers. And so she, and we've never spoken about that particular subject, though we've spoken about flat earthers, but not about the trauma hypothesis. But I'll be interested to see what she does with this, because she is qualified to have a whole picture of them. And my job was not to paint an entire psychological portrait of them, but I have to say, by being there and just paying attention, I did notice certain themes.
And there's a bit of discussion about the role social media plays in all of this in the book. And I think anyone who spends any amount of time on social media will very quickly realize that giving everyone on the planet anonymous voices and platforms may not have been the best idea.
Yeah.
But we're here now. And I think it's sort of an interesting, how do we deal with that? But I had a more specific question, and that's talking about the ego aspect of this. So I'm trying to find the note on the specific. Here it is. Peter Boghossian, Boghossian, I probably said wrong, and James Lindsay, in How to Have Impossible Conversations, they suggest avoid just using facts, and instead ask disconfirming questions, as you've noted, like what facts or evidence would change your mind. And in your book, you actually almost get to a flipped flat earther. You come very, very close by using that tactic. And it read like the best John Grisham for me, just so you know. That just reading that conversation and the progressions, it was exciting.
Good. That's nice.
So we're finding that a lot of this is maybe not about evidence, but about identity. As traditional media goes more and more political, yes, and social media does what it does, are these tools that we can use, again, depending on who we are as advocates of fact, to challenge people whose identities are that tied up to the point of dismissing clear evidence? Or is it always going to exist as a hindrance to that effort, do you think?
It's hard because, as you rightly point out, it is about identity, which means that, as I think I said in the book, so when you challenge their beliefs, you're challenging who they are as a person. And in a way, that's a much harder task, isn't it? Because if you just show a scientist the evidence, they change their belief, it's done. But to change somebody's identity, that is a much harder thing to do because it's nested in all of maybe what got them into it and their search for community and for belonging and meaning. And how do you do that? And so it is a puzzle and it is very difficult. The really weird thing is that people have found community in social media and even in major media, just in virtue of finding other people who agree with them or to tell them that they're smart. You talked about ego a minute ago. Nobody wants to feel like they've been duped or that, they don't know the answer. And so when deniers are isolated from one another, maybe they're more vulnerable to persuasion. But when they're together, either in, physically, like at the Flat Earth International Conference, or on social media, it's much harder to pry them apart because there is a sort of a tribal aspect to belief, even if it's about empirical subjects. And in fact, I'll go one better. In some ways, it isn't even about the subject. It's about the identity of the people who believe what you believe. And I say that because there are remarkable things in the literature where you will find, I'll just give you one from popular media. I don't know if you remember the photograph of these two gentlemen at a Trump rally wearing t-shirts that said, "I'd rather be a Russian than a Democrat."
Yeah.
Think about the 180 that the GOP had to turn to make being Russian preferable to being a Democrat.
Yeah.
But that's okay because it's not ideology, it's identity, right? It worked for them in a way. So it is a very difficult thing. Facts have a role, but if you just go in with what's called the information deficit model, oh, they just need to know what the facts are. And if they don't, walk away, they're not worth talking to. That's a huge mistake.
Yeah, and I found that really interesting too, because I, again, frequently, when I'm managing social media related stuff, I get so fed up and I just don't want to. I want to take my ball and go home. And it's in part, I think, for me, if someone gives me evidence, I'm going to sit and I'm going to look at that evidence. I'm going to ask questions about that evidence, and then I'll catalog it in my brain with everything else I have. And if it makes sense, it makes sense. Like if you said to me, "Hey, just so you know, the sky is now purple." You are an intelligent person. I'll say, "Oh, that's interesting." Then I'm going to look outside, and if the sky is purple, I'm going to go, "Oh, well, that's new." But if I look outside and the sky is blue, okay, now I need to ask some more questions about this. But when we start dealing with these very broad subjects such as gravity, and I found this amusing, as I was reading, I thought, well, could I defend science in any way as a non-scientist? And I went to YouTube and I searched, gravity experiments for high school students. Because I thought this is something we must clear, like by this point, with all of the genius people in the world, we got to be able to show this somehow. And I watched a couple of YouTube videos, and then I felt kind of dumb. And I guess, is there a Dunning-Kruger element to this of, I don't understand it, and I then sort of, to a degree, have to go on belief.
You put your finger on a very important thing there. Number one, it is extremely hard to come up with definitive, firsthand, what you've got in your pockets right this minute evidence to prove that the Earth is not flat. And that's what they demand. They demand proof. And science is not about proof. Science is about the preponderance of the evidence, which, as a scientist, you understand if the evidence racks up to a certain point, like for climate change, then you should believe it, but always hold out the possibility that future evidence might overthrow it. That's just how science works. So, the problem is that they're insisting on proof, but you cannot offer proof. And I think, and there's a little bit more psychologizing, I think that one thing that happens is that people watch flat Earth videos on YouTube that are trying to convince them that flat Earth is true, not the kind that you watched, right, to see how can I debunk these people, but the kind that make the argument that flat Earth is true. And if they can't figure out what's wrong with them, then it must be true. Like they give themselves so much credit, or they'll say, well, I flunked out of physics freshman year, but I can't figure out what's wrong here, so it must be true. Now, I've slandered them in saying that, and I'm not supposed to do that. But the problem is, in science, if you make a mistake, somebody else will catch you.
Yeah.
You don't give that much credence to your own, gut or your own instincts, because if you get something wrong, you will be corrected quite sharply, and that's an embarrassing thing. But I think that for a number of people who watch the flat Earth videos and get sucked in by them, they have such an enormously high regard for their own capacity to reason that they think, well, I can't see anything wrong with it. So, yes, it must be true, which raises a very important point. They often describe themselves as skeptics. They are not. They're gullible. They're skeptics about the things that they want to be skeptical about. They'll demand proof if it's something that they don't want to believe. But if it's something they do want to believe, they hardly need any evidence at all. So the areas where science deniers are really deficient in their reasoning about scientific topics is not the skepticism. They've got that down. It's when they need to be able to say, okay, if this were true, this experiment, this crucial experiment, then I would give up my belief and I'll change to something else. They don't understand that, because what they believe is really not based on evidence. It's really based, as we've said, on identity, on this sense of this makes them feel whole in a way. It's motivated reasoning, all of these other things that you can come up with from cognitive psychology, that it feels right to them, and they have, Dunning-Kruger effect. They have way too much confidence in their own intuition. And that's, by the way, the beautiful thing about science, because if you make one of those mistakes, you will get slapped back by your colleagues. And that's how we learn from nature.
Well, and interestingly, you of course, I don't know how you could write a book like this without bringing it up. Andrew Wakefield gets brought up in this, and for those unaware, he is the one who created a study, I believe. He kind of, sat down with his notebook in a dark corner and said, what are good numbers? That might be an oversimplification, but effectively fabricated evidence, screwed around with a study to make a connection, a causal link between vaccines and autism. His co-authors immediately pull out. Once it's published, everyone in the scientific community says, nope, it doesn't work. The numbers are wrong. Later comes out that he did fabricate evidence.
That's right.
Journal sends out a thing. He has his license revoked. Like the entire scientific community effectively said, he's what you're not supposed to do, and he's not allowed to play anymore. And as such, he's now touring, I believe, still talking about this.
Oh, he's a celebrity. He's an absolute celebrity at anti-vax conferences.
I guess I don't know what the question is there. I'm just stunned. And I'll tell you, as someone who has immunocompromised people in their life, and I've got a horrifying story involving measles. I'll tell you off the air if you're interested, but it just baffles me. It truly, truly does. And it becomes hard then, as I said, to interestingly remain reasonable with people. Do you have tools you use to tap down, whether it be anger or just the urge to just laugh sometimes in these situations? I mean, you seem very stoic right now. I am clearly not stoic. How do you manage that element of it?
I guess I'm always curious about why they believe what they believe, and just stubborn enough as a philosopher that I think if I talk to them long enough, maybe I could talk them out of it. So I don't quite have the, well, I just need to get out of here reaction. It's more, now, wait a minute, let's pull up the chair and really, go over this. I just want to, keep hammering away at it. There's one thing that really, and I mean, the inconsistencies like you bring up really bother me. Why do they trust Andrew Wakefield, but they won't trust someone else? If they're such distrustful people, again, it's selective. It's cafeteria skepticism. They don't trust this, but they do trust that. And, it's based on what they want to believe. There's one really important thing that keeps me going in this, and it's the idea that science deniers, for most of them, are victims.
Mhm.
Because it's really important to remember that science denial is not a mistake, it's a lie. They didn't just wake up one day, 100,000 people and say, I wonder if we really went to the moon, or
Mhm.
I wonder if there's a link between that the MMR vaccine and autism, or what. This didn't just happen to occur to all these people at the same time. Denial is created, and it's created by people who have an interest at stake in misleading us. So
Mhm.
that means that it's not misinformation, it's disinformation. It started with the tobacco companies
Mhm.
who decided that they didn't want to believe that cigarette smoking caused lung cancer. And so they hired a public relations expert to help them to get that message out. It then went on to climate change, where the fossil fuel companies were horrified by the idea that climate change was real, even though their own scientists had told them that it was real,
Yep.
which enabled them to make projections about drilling in the Arctic once the polar ice cap had melted. I mean, so talk about cynical. They knew that. Okay.
Yeah.
So, these are people who have interests at stake. And how much better, if you've got an interest at stake, to create an army of people who are on your side. They don't need to prove what they think. They just need there to be enough doubt and confusion. Okay. That gives me some empathy for science deniers, because the vast majority of climate deniers don't get a cent out of it.
Yeah.
They're, it what really bothers me is that they're conspiracy theorists, and they don't see a real conspiracy right in front of their eyes when they're being duped. I start the book with a quotation from Mark Twain, attributed, who knows if he actually said it, that it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled.
Yep.
How do you tell somebody, no, 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 don't you understand where the dark money is that created the disinformation that you're now spouting back to me? It's difficult. So that keeps me going.
Yeah, the flip side of that, and I've got two questions related to this. One, I had already written about the cigarette smoking, which I am so glad you included, because I think it is a fascinating example.
Mhm.
And again, pointing to real life conspiracies are a thing. This isn't denying
That's right.
conspiracies, it's denying conspiracy theories with no evidence.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's right. No evidence.
So I've now forgotten the first question, so we'll skip to the second one. In talking about the cigarette smoking and PR link, which was, again, I just love reading different angles on and different considerations about. I'm old enough to remember a time when I'd go to the shopping mall and there was a smoking section. All cars shipped with multiple ashtrays and lighters. And even in non-smoking homes like mine growing up, there were ashtrays for when people who smoked
Of
visit.
course.
At some point, right? Like now, there's a generation of people who may not ever believe that was real, and they've only ever known tobacco to be unhealthy, highly taxed. In Canada, the package is just covered with warnings now. Very little actual marketing space. So how do we learn from that scenario where there was a very, very influential and wealthy lobby effort to create disinformation in the public that lasted generations and is still being managed? There's still people who
That's
smoke.
right.
There's still kids who are starting to smoke.
That's right.
But we have come a significant way in that regard.
What works is to expose the tactics. They were, now I say that understanding that, it took decades to leak the tobacco memos,
Yeah.
where they finally figured out there was one that said, doubt is our product.
Yes.
And that comes out and it's a scandal. Well, the cigarette companies ultimately paid a multi-million-dollar a settlement 30 years later on the theory that, okay, everybody now knows that it's dangerous. Let us go ahead and keep selling our cigarettes. So there's a financial interest for them to create this sort of doubt. With climate change, the memos leaked much earlier, but it didn't make very much of a difference, right? So you raise a good question, right? How can you put the evidence right in front of people's face to say, these people are duping you. This is what they're doing, and they don't believe it. Contemporary example, COVID denial.
Mm-hmm.
COVID denial before our very eyes. I mean, as a scholar in this area, I was mesmerized watching every day as this topic that really could have gone either way was spun politically. And we were polarized and made into this science denial topic, and it was just it was horrifying to watch. But here we are. The bad news is that disinformation convinces people. Once disinformation is loose, it will do damage. There's some scientific evidence that you can mitigate that damage, and I talk about that in the book. But there will inevitably be damage once disinformation is out there, and that's why it's important to talk to science deniers to keep them from further spreading the disinformation. But it's also important to realize, and this is something I don't say very much about in the book, though I'm thinking about it more now. We have to figure out how to stop the creation and amplification of disinformation, because there are really not that many people doing it.
Yes.
There was an article in NPR the other day, reported by NPR, that 65% of the anti-vax propaganda on Twitter was due to 12 people.
Yes.
Now they can do 12 people can do an enormous amount of damage, because disinformation is just so virulent. So I think that gives us some hope that if we could ever figure out, in the United States at least, how to think about how to not give a platform to liars without having everybody reflexively say, oh, you're hurting their free speech rights. Mm-hmm. To have a serious conversation about that and figure out what we should really do. I think we could do that. We're clearly not there yet.
Yeah, I was remembering I just pulled up my copy to look at this statement, and this was a reference from Conspiracy Theory Handbooks, Stefan Lewandowski and John Cook, talking about Reddit. An analysis of over 2 million comments on the subreddit site Our Conspiracy found only 5% of posters exhibited conspiratorial thinking. They were responsible for 64% of all comments, and the most active author wrote 896,337 words, twice the length of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So that's one of those.
One guy.
Yeah.
One guy.
And
twice the Lord of the Rings.
It's impressive. And I wanted to put this in context for myself. As I said, I was a newspaper reporter for a long time. I just pulled up some rough numbers, figure, okay, I would write an average of 2 500-word articles per week. And it was a weekly paper. It would have taken me 10 full years of doing that, 50 times a week. And I would still be 100,000 words less than this person created. As a professional writer and content creator, I could not produce as much. And that was a very staggering realization for me of how much time and effort gets put in. But then also, I believe it was related to climate change. A percentage of them were just created by bots too.
That's true. That's true. There are, and don't forget that it's not. I mean, we talk about it being, one person, and in some cases it's one person or a dozen people. But in other ways, regarding not just the creation, but the amplification of these messages, there are troll farms in Russia, mm-hmm. where, entire towns that are taken over with people who are pumping this stuff out there to try to, I don't know, confuse us, polarize us. There was a terrific article in the New York Times a few years back called Putin's Long War Against American Science, where it's just laid out that on GMOs, on vaccines, on climate, they're messing with us on purpose, to try to, I don't know, create dissent in the society, to try to get us fighting with one another. It's, people sometimes ask, why is there so much science denial in the United States? It's because we're being targeted.
Yeah.
We're the subject of these disinformation campaigns that, along existing fault lines of red and blue America, that have now gotten to the point of what sometimes feels like near civil war.
Yeah, it is and again, watching that from north of the border is terrifying.
I
It really,
bet.
really is. And
I bet it
it
is.
even happens here, though. We end up with protests of, anti-vaxxers and Trump supporters. You can't even
In
vote for the
Canada.
guy. Why are you
Yeah.
protesting for him? And again, you brought up Russia earlier and why it's such a big deal that Americans are they are willing to say, I trust Russia more than Democrats. And for those
Yes.
who may not know, in Canada and elsewhere in the world, or a younger generation, America was kind of at a non-war war with Russia since around 1946. Like there's entire texts and university programs about the Cold War and how Russia was the ideological enemy of America. I mean, just watch any 80s action movie and the bad guys are the
Right.
Russians, right? That's why. So for an entire society or a percentage of that society to go, oh no, we believe them more, to me is very, very surprising and terrifying. And we're working on a wall of our own now. But
And not to mention the fact that the primary progenitors of that anti-Russia message were Republicans
yes,
through the 50s, the Red Scare.
yep.
They were the people who were the tip of the spear anti-Russia,
Mhm.
and now not.
Yeah, it is the best argument for why we need more history lessons in schools, in my opinion, more social sciences. Because again, it's if you just look at history, it's like, oh, there it is happening before.
Yes.
I've used a lot of your time. I'm going to try and wrap up with two questions. One of them is about anecdotes, and this is something that I come up a lot against as an advocate and as a communicator. And I'll use coyotes as an example. And I'm not expecting you to know a lot about coyotes or biology or any of those things, but in general, the current evidence is that when we try and cull coyotes, we end up with more coyotes. There's a lot of different reasons for it around resources and so on and social structure, but pretty collectively, everyone involved with the science agrees to that. I will have people on social media say things like, well, I saw a coyote when I was younger take down, a Buick. Or I saw a coyote lure all of the dogs out to the pasture where 20 more were waiting with handguns. I'm being a little hyperbolic for my own amusement, but they tend to be, anecdotal things where I understand from that perspective. It may look like this is the thing that happened, but you're denying cognition and behavioral science and resources and all of these other factors because the coyote luring your off-leash dog away from your home in the middle of the night is potentially more palatable than your dog who was off-leash in the middle of the night went for a wander and found a coyote. Is there $1 million question? Is there an easy or straightforward way to say the flaw is not in your perception, the flaw is in your reasoning of applying that perception to reality?
That's a hard question because you notice that the two different ways that you framed that were two different narratives.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the hallmarks of what we think of as post-truth is that there are competing narratives, alternative facts, if you will.
Yeah.
Different ways of looking at the same situation. Now, people rebel against that, and I think rightly so, to say no. There's a right and a wrong way to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
I think of post-truth as the political subordination of reality, where you want to frame the thing that's happening as subordinate to the political outcome that you wish were happening. The coyote example reminds me very much of the way that people talk about crime.
Mm-hmm.
There are various ways to spin conversations about crime to make you think that crime is going up when it's not actually going up. There was a famous bit of video footage in which I believe it was it was Newt Gingrich who was having an on-air exchange with Alice Camerata from CNN, talking about how people felt that the crime rate was going up. And she was saying, no, that it actually wasn't. And he said, well, you can go with what the statistics are, I'll go with how people feel. That's the problem, right? That there are facts and there is truth. Mm-hmm. And there can be different ways of describing it, but some sometimes facts overturn the narratives. Sometimes people say various things in their narrative that are not borne out by the facts, and so those narratives are false. When we stop caring about that, when we start saying, well, yes, but I feel that that's a more accurate depiction of reality, even though it's not, that's when we're in big trouble. Well, because that's when we reach the point where no amount of evidence will do. Think about an anti-vaxxer. What evidence would you have to offer that would convince them that vaccines were safe? Because you can't prove it.
Yeah.
Science can't prove that aspirin is safe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and yet people get into airplanes, they drive cars, they smoke, they do all sorts of things that aren't safe and don't give a second thought about it. But for vaccines, that taps something in their brain that says, unsafe, maybe because of the government or pharmaceutical companies or whatever it is. It's a problem. I mean, so yes, the way that we frame something can give the narrative about it can make a big difference.
That's really great advice. Excuse me. I have an exercise I like to do I'll do webinars and seminars on media sensationalism and wildlife, and I will often say, let's take this article and then just pull the actual facts. So remove all interpretation and what do we know actually happened. And it tends to be 3 points for a quarter page article, because the rest of it is then, expert opinion or the description of how terrified someone was for 3 paragraphs,
That's
which
right.
Again, as a journalist, I know causes someone else to feel that fear. And as soon as they feel that fear, they are experiencing that fear, and their brain can't make a difference between experiencing it and feeling it. It's the whole concept of PTSD, that your brain is just switched back to being in that moment.
I've got a mundane example of this.
Mm-hmm.
I own 2 German Shepherds.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm out walking them, people cross the street.
Oh, yeah.
Because they're German Shepherds. And God forbid if they would bark or, tug at the leash a little bit, then it's, that's a dangerous dog. I remember one thing, an obligation when you have a German Shepherd is you have to have them well trained, because as my trainer put it doesn't matter whose fault it is. After the encounter, you're the one standing there holding the leash for the big bad German Shepherd.
Yep.
So perceptions, narratives can make a big difference. Even if it wasn't my dog's fault, even if the runner was running straight at me, or even if the other person's dog got off leash and attacked my dog, still my fault.
Yeah.
So which is why you have to do the training. So I understand.
Yeah. And as we were discussing before the podcast, I also have a shepherd mix, and my past dogs have also been big black and tan dogs.
Yeah.
And as goofy and silly as I am 6 foot, 215 pounds, have a big beard and a big voice. There are numerous times I have gotten into confrontations that I walked away from after making a really smarmy, witty response to something. And I know I can walk away from it because I'm a big white guy, even though I'm completely nonviolent. And if you blow at me, I'll fall down crying. Just that perception in the moment is enough to buy me 30 seconds of getaway time. So it's interesting how that perception seeps into everything, including privilege.
Yes, it's true.
And to wrap up, I want to talk about hope. You had mentioned that knowing that you can make a bit of a difference is something that drives you, and knowing that the issue is still there. I think as I read the book, it felt overwhelming to me at times. We talk about the scope of these problems. We talk about the realities of having people who truly fight back against the concept of climate change, which, as you note in the book, and now with even more recent information, is getting more and more and more certain according to science. Talking about, we all saw what happened on January 6th this year at the election. There are real consequences to some of this. And it's frightening, just plain and simple. In the face of that, and in the face of, realizing these tech companies aren't doing a lot and governments are encouraging it, how do you maintain hope that reason can prevail in modern society?
Reason has overcome the odds time and again. Mm-hmm. The dark ages were 600, 700 years long, but we came out of it. I mean, when people care enough, but because that's really what it comes down to. It's not the facts, it's the caring.
Mm-hmm.
Part of my mission is not just to change the mind of the science deniers, it's to change the mind of the general public that they can do something about science denial, because they tend to think that they can't. So part of the point of my book is, what, are you going to be a science denier? Because there is science which shows that you can change a science denier's mind. And if you're just going to walk away and say, nope, not for me, you're kind of in a way being a science denier. Mm-hmm. I would like to create an army of people who were allies of science, who understood the techniques for pushing back, and who cared enough to actually do it. I think that we could make some headway with the science deniers themselves, not through confrontation, but through engagement, through patience and calm and respect, understanding that in some ways they're victims. I think that we could really have take some of the polarity out of the polarization that's happened in the last few years, okay? But I think that also we could have an enormous political impact. When you look at the current crises that motivate people to vote, even as bad as climate change has gotten, it's very rarely in any poll that I see does it come in anything above third or fourth. Mm-hmm. People are more concerned about other things. If we actually cared about it more, if we had more people who were awake to this, who cared as much about science as the science deniers care about whatever their issue is, I think that we could have an effect on government, on policy, and make more of a difference. It is really part of the lesson that I learned in writing this book is that science denial is not just about facts, it's about caring. It's about, what are you concerned with? What do you care enough about to want to make a difference? The pivotal conversation there that I had was with coal miners in rural Pennsylvania, who one assumes would be climate deniers, but they weren't. They believed in climate change and yet still went down to the mines every day. Mm-hmm. So, and it wasn't that they didn't care, because some of them were grandfathers. I mean, they did care. They expressed to me their concern. The problem was that they didn't have any choice.
Yeah.
So it's this question of, again, I come back to the question of victimhood. The people in the Maldives are the victims of the rest of our decisions about climate change. The people who are working in the coal industry, who are not, at the top, the ones pulling the strings with the dark money, are also victims. There are an awful lot of people who are hurt by science denial, who are not speaking up. And one thing I'm doing in the book is giving them the means to say, you know what? I can speak up, and here's what I can say, and here was his experience, and here's the empirical backup, and here's 80 pages of footnotes. Mm-hmm. It's going to tell me, where I can get more information. I want it to be a handbook to help people understand that they too can do this. I went to a flat Earth convention with 650 flat earthers. You can talk to your cousin about vaccines. It's really possible to do.
And it's beautifully said. I just can't help but think there's going to be a meme going out tomorrow of McIntyre forms army of coyotes to eat anti-vaxxers or something now, because that's just the way it goes, it seems.
It's why you need to be calm and patient, right? Because the minute I lose my temper, the minute I tell somebody off, or say, well, that's just ridiculous, even, or insult them with the camera going, I've lost credibility in this debate. Absolutely. And the thing is, as much as I wanted to debunk the flat earthers when I was speaking with them, mm-hmm. I didn't dislike them. I didn't feel angry. I was fascinated and kind of, put off sometimes. There was one moment when I did feel angry, which I dealt with by leaving. And that was when they were talking about how to recruit children into flat Earth.
Yeah, that was hard to read.
That did make me angry because I'm a dad. Mm-hmm. And my feeling was, these kids don't have a chance. The adults, they changed their mind. They could change it back. But the kids, they were being indoctrinated in this. That did make me mad.
Yeah. And I guess then I'm going to lie and give you one more quick question. Is there a way for us to then avoid the flip side of that, wherein, and I made a joke about it, of they're going to pluck 4 keywords from this entire conversation and come up with a storyline. Is there a way to avoid that same flip side of, well, look, McIntyre went on this podcast and talked with an animal guy. Therefore, everything that guy said, McIntyre now agrees with, and they're on the same side, and there's funding questions and all of this.
People, what have you dragged me into? People will people will say what they're going to say. They will come to whatever conclusions they're going to come to. I get mail which points out every flaw I've ever made, and most of the ones I haven't made, and there's really not a lot that you can do about it. I think that sometimes that kind of thing is intended to stop me. Mm-hmm. And it's not going to stop me because I care about this issue too much. It bothers me. When I was a kid, I was fascinated with the World Book Encyclopedia. Yeah. I used to read about the scientists and the philosophers and the writers and think, look at all these great people in history who stood up for science and reason. I was born too late. All of these the battles, Galileo, my great hero, on my office wall, picture. I'm too late. Who's the enlightenment? The Dark Ages are over. The Enlightenment has happened. All the science and technology. Oh well. Yeah. Here we are. Here we are because human intransigence and ignorance is evergreen. And we do need to fight back. We do need to figure out what's behind this. The internet has increased the stakes. It has made it, very difficult because the disinformation, the thing that presses the fear button, is much more likely to be believed and, to get spread around than the, take it down a notch. Let's have a rational conversation about this. But like I said, this is why I care about it so much, because my perception is that this problem is getting worse over time. And that I think that the political situation in Washington, D.C. right now grew out of 60 years of unchecked science denial. I think that the politicians looked at what had happened with tobacco and climate change and said, wow, we can do that for crime. We can do that for who won the election. Yeah. We can do that with, whether they were peaceful protesters on January 6th or not. That's when it metastasizes. That's when it's not just about money in the pockets of some executives. That's when it gets scary, because then things like QAnon and other conspiracies begin to take over. It's taken over, not QAnon, but this kind of cult of Trump has taken over one of the two main political parties in the United States. There was a government in Italy that was anti-vax for a while. I mean, science, and look what Bolsonaro is doing down in Brazil. Yeah. Science denial has now reached the highest levels of government, and it is morphing into reality denial about things that we should really care about. Not just climate change. I'm talking about truth and facts in general.
To find out more about Dr. Lee McIntyre and how to talk to a science denier, published by MIT Press this year, visit leemcintyrebooks.com. Links are available in this week's show notes at defenderradio.com or in your podcast app. I want to deeply thank Dr. McIntyre for sharing his time with me. I genuinely could have kept this conversation going for hours. I strongly recommend checking out How to Talk to a Science Denier at your local library or bookstore. I'm already adjusting my thought process on how I engage on certain subjects as a result of reading this book. I also want to thank you for listening. Please remember to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. You'll get notified of new episodes of Defender Radio and The Switch as soon as they drop. Please also consider leaving a rating or review where you listen or on the Defender Radio Facebook page, as this also helps new listeners find the show and increases our reach. You can follow me on TikTok and Instagram at Howie Michael, where I'm posting questions about upcoming interviews, giveaways, and getting your feedback. You can find the Fur Bearers on Instagram and Twitter at FurBearers and on Facebook at facebook.com/furfree. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio and the Fur Bearers, reminding you to be kind and to stay informed and stay strong.